This solution demonstration is going to focus on how we can use functions to create like a little unit of code that will complete one task for us. And I'm not going to try and use this to cover all of the idea of functions. I'm really going to focus on passing data back and forth using arguments and return statements. And as part of that, I want to emphasize the difference and the importance between returning a value and printing or outputting a value, which is a real common mistake students make when they're working with methods for the first time, functions for the first time, excuse me. And you may hear me do that throughout the video, referring to functions as methods. They are essentially the same thing. We use the word method in slightly different contexts sometimes. All right. As is always the case with these videos, I recommend that the best way to get something out of it is to take a look at the problem, pause the video, and go off and try and solve it on your own first. And then whether you finish or you get stuck, you can come back here and run through the rest of the video to see how I solved it. So with that, here is the problem. And again, I would encourage you to pause here and take a shot at it, then come back when you're ready to jump in. All right, so I've gone ahead and set up a file in my PyCharm project with a little bit of a heading up there to explain what it does, and we'll go ahead and jump right in. And so I'm going to begin by thinking about almost the user interface, where the first thing I'm going to do is prompt the user to input a waist size in inches. And so I'm going to need a variable to put that in. I'll call it waist size and input all right, and I am going to be I won't be doing math with it per se. I sometimes say, well, if we're going to do math with it, we want to convert it to a number. I'm not really going to be doing math with this, but I'm going to be doing what we call range checking. I'm going to be checking to see if the value is between two other values, right? If it's between the two values for a medium, then I want to return medium. So I am going to want to work with this as a number. So I'm going to convert this to an integer right off the bat there. Good. And the next part of this, you can imagine if we were writing this without a method, without a function, excuse me, that we would now start with some branching, right? We'd do some if statements here. But what I'm going to do instead is I am going to define a function that will do that for us. And by convention, meaning it's not critical that you do it this way, but the way most people do this is to define functions at the top of our program or the top of our script. And so I'm going to call this pants size. So just like a variable, a method should have a name that is descriptive of what it does or what it calculates, and especially in this case, like what it returns. So this is going to return, it's going to give back the pants size, small, medium, large, XL, whatever. And so I'm going to call it pants size, as opposed to calling it, for example, my function, which I often see on student submissions. There's nothing wrong with that in a technical sense. Python doesn't care what you call it, but there's something very wrong with that from a readability standpoint, especially if you start having lots of methods, which is often the case in programming. We need to have clear names so that we can tell, oh, this is the method that does that. And in fact, I'm also going to just add a little comment under here that says that this is going to accept waist size and return the pants size, just so that when someone is looking at the code, they know exactly what it does. Now, again, I'm not going to cover everything about functions in this video, but what I do want to point out is whenever we see parentheses, we are talking about a function. And so those parentheses are important, even if I don't have an argument or a parameter to put in there. In this case, we do have something we need to put in there. The directions say that, and proper programming techniques would say that what I want to do is send that input into this function so that they can it can use that information to determine the pant size. And some of the things in this video, the reason I made a video about it is because the concepts are sometimes difficult for beginners to get their heads around. And Python, I would say, unfortunately, Python gives us some ways to sort of go around this and do it different ways. And so you might turn in code that works perfectly well if you just look at it from the user's standpoint, but you don't get a good grade on it because your teacher grades it based on the code, and your boss someday is expecting to write code and they want it written a certain way. So again, part of the point of this is to show you the way that we're intending for you to try this and to demonstrate this on the assignment. So this method, this function, in order to determine the size, small, medium, large, etc., we need to know a piece of information. We need to know how big their waist is. So that is an argument or a parameter. And so I'm going to call that waist. Now I am trying to be careful to use different names here. So down here I've called my input waist size, and here I'm going to call it waist, right? So that you can tell this line 10, this is going to get passed into the function, and inside the function we're going to refer to it as waist. And later in the video I'll talk a little bit, why do we care? Why don't we just use waist size and not pass it around at all? And I'll talk about that when we kind of get to that point. All right, and the other thing I like to do right off the bat, well actually I'll wait on that too so I can kind of talk my way through it. At this point I just need to write my branching logic, my conditional logic, to make this determination of what pant size we need to find. So if waist is greater than equal to, and I don't remember my sizes here, so I'm going to have to peek at the chart, 27 to 29. If it's greater than or equal to 29 and waist is less than or equal to 29, then I'm going to say that the calculated size is small. All right. Now there's only one possible size, right? The chart is set up to allow that, and let's face it, the customer is going to buy one pair of pants. So each from this list of if statements, we really only want one result, and so I'm going to use elif waist is greater than equal to I'll say 30 to 32 here. Medium. And I'm going to pause there for a moment, and I will start to talk a little bit about the difference between outputting a result and returning a result. And so what many of us would be tempted to do is, well, why are we putting this in a variable here? Why aren't we just printing it out? So I'm just going to say print small, right? So now when it figures out that their waist size is 28 and it goes inside that range, it's going to just print small. So this is outputting a result or printing a result. And in some cases, that is absolutely fine. Most of the time, and in this chapter, this module that you're working on now especially, we want you to return that value. In other words, pass it back to where it came from. And it is sometimes slippery for students to get their heads around why this difference matters. All right. So I will first, let me show the difference. And so what I like to do if I'm going to return a value is I like to create that variable right at the top, and I'll just set it to an empty string. And then at the very bottom of my method, I'm just going to return it. Okay. And now what we can do is we can call this pant size method. So I'm going to say pant size, and then I'm going to pass in the waist size. Okay, and let's try running our code here and see what we get. So I'm going to type in 28, and you think, oh, great, that works perfectly. And it does, in that particular case, work perfectly. I haven't finished all of my my branching yet, but it works so far. Unfortunately, this isn't going to get a good score because the directions specifically say to not print inside the function and to return that value. And so as a demonstration of that, I have that other if statement, the medium. So let's say they're in a size 31, they're size 31, and nothing has happened. Well, what's that about? We have to do something with this value that it has returned. We have returned calculated size, and I'm not doing anything. So this essentially, you can think of it like a variable. It's going to be an M in this case. And so the simplest thing I could do is just say print it out. And let's try that and see how it works. And so I'll say, what was it, 31? There we go. And what you would justifiably be saying is, well, what the heck, that's more work to do it your way than to just have the print statement up here. And so there are some reasons why we don't want that. The most important one is because the point of this assignment is to assess whether you understand how return statements work and how to pass data back and forth. So for that reason alone, as a student, you got to do it the way that you're being asked to do, or don't complain if you don't get full points, right? So you may not like that reason, but that is a completely valid reason. I need to assess whether or not you know how to use return statements appropriately instead of output, because sometimes we have methods that need to calculate something and not output it. If I'm writing a computer game and it's a shooter and somebody fires a laser, I need to calculate how fast that laser is going. I don't need to print that speed on the screen. I just need to find out the value and do something with it. So there are often cases when we don't want to print. So you have to know how to do that. Again, you may not like that answer, but you're going to like this one even less, which is that sometimes when you're a beginning programmer, you can't see the bigger picture, which is that as a general rule in programming, we want to separate the logic, like the back end, from the user interface or the front end. In the same way that in a restaurant, if you've worked in a restaurant, they call it the front of house and the back of house. Like the front of house is the person who does the seating and the waiters and waitresses, servers, I guess we should be calling them, bartenders, people that interface with the customers. And then the back of house are the people who prepare the food. It's the same thing. And as a beginner, you might not understand why that's important, but we want to separate those two things as much as possible. So this is a method that calculates what size pants we need. It doesn't have anything to do with the customer. It's going to calculate that and then give it back to whoever asked for it, and then they can deal with the customer. So I'm afraid I don't have a better answer for you than that without going down a rabbit hole that's beyond the scope of the video. So I'm going to fall back to that first thing, which is, well, the requirement is to return it. So calculated size equals. Now, another best practice I'm going to say is similar to that, which is instead of just directly printing this out, we really should store it in a variable, because we might want to do more than just print it out. We might want to make some calculations based on that or whatever. So, maybe now we have to go and look up the price, based on, maybe extra large costs more than a medium or something like that. So, or we have to go check and see if they're available, all kinds of things. So I'm going to do it like that. What I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to pause the video and I'm going to run out the rest of my elif statements, because you don't need to watch me write that code. So through the magic of video editing here, let me jump to that. All right, so I've typed the rest of those elif statements, and you'll notice that PyCharm is warning me that there is a perhaps better way to write those statements, and that's fine. And if you prefer to write them that way, that's okay. I like to write them out this way because I think the logic then is real clear to students. If the waist is greater than or equal to 36 and the waist is less than or equal to 39, then it's an XL, and I like the way that reads for a video like this where I'm teaching students how to do this. Okay, so next, I'm going to jump down here, and I need to, after I've gotten this completed, what you'll notice here is I've got all this code that's indented that is part of the method, the function, definition, and then I've got really just 2 lines of code that's in my actual program. I'm going to need a third because I'm going to have to output something, and I'll give it a little bit of user interface, so to speak. I'll make it say something instead of just outputting the letter, and that's always a good idea. I know, programmers aren't famous for liking to type, but when you turn in a program for an assignment, make it say something, not just S for small. So the correct, for waist size of, let's see, waist size, inches, the correct pant size is, and correct size. And so again, just to make it a little more user friendly, I'll try a couple of inputs here. We'll say 38. That's an XL. We'll try 43. That's a double XL. And let's try, what if we put in a number that's not valid, like we put in 20. So this, I think, is going to be the last thing that we're missing. The directions say that if they input a number where we can't find a size, we should say something appropriate. And so I could manage that down here. What we've done, just to be clear in case you don't get what happened, is I defined calculated size as what we call an empty string, right? And if none of these if statements fire, get executed, then it's still an empty string. So it just returns that empty string here. So I could now do an if statement down here and say, well, if it was an empty string, then say something else. But I could also just have an else statement that says calculated size equals no size available, something like that. And I believe that will solve that problem. And make sure none of these little messages are significant. I believe that is it for this program. Let me just test that last little bit. If I put in 20, it should say there is no size available. I might want to get rid of the capital letter there just so that it makes sense. But I believe this is finished. What I'm going to point out again, just as a final thought or a final emphasis of this, is that my main program is really only 3 lines. And what we are doing is we are passing data back and forth. So I'm calling this pant size function and I'm passing it the waist size. It is then doing some calculations of whatever it needs to do. And it is returning back to me. It is passing back to me the calculated size. And I do want to point out that there are plenty of functions that either don't take an argument, you don't have to pass anything to it, and that don't pass anything back when they're done. There are definitely situations where that is the way to go, but my experience is that this passing back and forth is a tricky concept for students, and so that's why we are trying to emphasize it here. As is always the case, please reach out to me if you have any questions or if there's anything about this video or this topic that I can clarify.